Welcome everyone to the HL7 open source tooling series. Today we welcome the infamous and very valuable FHIR community member, James Agnew, to share information about the HAPI FHIR project. So I'll turn it over to him now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sandy, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Let's kick this off and talk a little bit about HAPI and the HAPI project. A little bit about me before we get started. I have the most professional bio I could possibly, professional headshot I could possibly find. I have been the CTO, and I call myself the head geek with Smile Digital Health for 2017. Smile is a company that supports HAPI. I'll talk a tiny bit about that a little bit later. More importantly, to today's webinar, I have been the project lead for the HAPI project since all the way back in 2004. Always makes me feel old saying that, but there we go. And I think most importantly, I have been a huge advocate for open source and standards for, well, a long time now. So I call myself a standards geek for life. I'm a firm believer in the mission of HL7 and the work that we're all doing together. So there we go. This incidentally on my picture is my sidekick, Dharma. She's sitting almost right next to me in the office today. So there we go. Really hoping she doesn't bark during this webinar, but we'll see what happens. So let's talk a little bit about HAPI. Incidentally, you might have noticed on the title slide, which now it's not letting me go back, so oh well. It mentioned HAPI HL7 v2 and HAPI FHIR. We've actually got two sister libraries. I am going to focus today on HAPI FHIR. Obviously, FHIR is the future of HL7 standards, and it's where all the excitement is. So that's what I'm going to be mostly talking about today. I'm going to talk very briefly, though, about HAPI HL7 v2 as well. Which is our sister library and certainly the older library of the two. So there we go. I want to start a little bit by talking about a history of the HAPI project. I think a lot of people are not aware of how old and sort of where this project comes from. And it really, to me, it's actually kind of an interesting story, and I won't take too long with it, but I think it's kind of a fun story to tell. But way back in the year 2000, which, in the world of tech just feels like an entire lifetime ago, I was recently started. I started, I guess, a little bit after the very origin story of HAPI, but I started with a big teaching hospital network in Toronto, Canada, called University Health Network. University Health Network, or UHN as they call themselves, a big teaching hospital that traditionally has had a huge research department and a very big focus on developing innovative solutions across healthcare, certainly including healthcare tech solutions. And they've produced all kinds of interesting innovations over the years. A project that they got started way back in 2000 was building a little web-based portal that would share health data results, like things like lab tests and imaging summaries and things like that, across hospital boundaries. In other words, exchanging data with hospitals in the same sort of general geographic area. Everyone at the hospitals in their immediate area used a different EHR. They all had EHRs in those days, fortunately, but really the concept of interoperability across organizations really didn't exist. And they wanted to build a portal that would allow doctors practicing at one location to see access to a complete longitudinal health record for the patient in front of them, spanning all of the different institutions that patient might have visited within the Toronto area. These days, I think we would call what UHN was building back then a health information exchange, an HIE. But of course, this was well before the days where the term HIE was even in common use. I've got a screenshot of the system that ultimately got built. It was a system called PRO, Patient Results Online. And I look back at this screenshot often and just marvel at how neat it was for its time. I think looking at it through a modern lens, I mean, it's kind of an outdated interface, and the concept of bringing in data from a couple of different hospitals and showing them in an aggregate view. I mean, at this point, it's not that that's completely routine, but there's plenty of systems out there that do that. In 2000, there really weren't plenty of systems out there that did that. I mean, we looked far and wide and couldn't find almost any good examples of people that were building tech like this. We thought this was exciting to do. One of our big challenges in doing this was that to do any kind of interoperability with the several different EHR platforms that were in use across the various hospitals, we had to speak HL7 version 2, the older HL7 standard, and certainly still a very popular standard. And we realized that if we were going to do that, we were going to have to write software libraries that would support that protocol for our own uses. And we started thinking, like, why don't we just open source that work? And that was the genesis of the HAPI HL7 V2 project. So right starting in 2001, we had an open source project implementing the open specs for HL7 V2. That was a very different time. I'm going to try and be brief on all of this because I know you're not here to learn about the ancient history of V2 open source libraries, but it was a really interesting time. I mean, HL7 itself was a very different organization back then. This was before the open IP policies that have become all the rage with HL7 these days. And figuring out how to thread the needle between, providing a functional library but not disclosing HL7's internal IP for free out in the internet was a really difficult challenge, and one that we struggled, but I think did successfully navigate for many, many years. And the HL7 V2 library, I'm not actually going to say a whole lot more about it. I've got one slide at the very end to talk about sort of where you can learn more about that project. But I will say it's an open source, freely available library you could use to add HL7 V2 capabilities to your applications. And if you're in a world where you've got to interface with EHRs that speak HL7 V2 today, and that is absolutely still a situation many people find themselves in, that library might be useful to you, especially if you're a Java programmer. So think about checking that library out. Who knows? Might be useful to you. So over the 2000s, that project developed quite a following. Actually, we were based on SourceForge. SourceForge, of course, was the popular open source hub before GitHub came along. It's no longer such a popular place, but it provided, among other things, a CVS-based code repository, which there's another funny old blast from the past term, and a super active mailing list. We developed quite the community, and many outside contributions flowed in around that library. It took us 10 whole years from the very start of our project to actually release 1.0 of the library. We had a whole bunch of point releases over the years, but by 2010, we decided, okay, this library is, I probably should have hit 1.0 long before that. But we decided, let's stamp this as 1.0. And these days, I think the current release is 2.5 of HAPI FHIR. So we've continued to, or sorry, of HAPI HL7 V2. And we've continued to iterate on that library over the many years. These days, we don't have a lot of development activity on that library. I mean, HL7v2, the standard, has really slowed down quite a bit, so we don't need to do a whole lot of work in maintaining the library, but we do still support it. We do still release new versions. We fix bugs, we fix security issues if when they occasionally come in. So we do continue to maintain that library. And I will say it is the basis for interoperability in countless applications around the world. We're aware of everything from government projects and government departments, huge EHR vendors. Some of the biggest names in health software around the world have used HAPI as a part of their V2 suite. So it's embedded in all kinds of projects around the world. Frankly, I'd say if you have been a patient anywhere in the Western world in the last decade, chances are your data has been represented by HAPI HL7 V2 at some point along the way. It really has. It has been a strangely dominant force in interoperability. Continuing my history, by 2012, UHN had some really interesting infrastructure they developed to support a bunch more use cases internal to their own operations. Effectively, they built a little proprietary clinical data repository. And this data repository wasn't terribly fancy. It was a series of tables in an Oracle database, and we'd used our HAPI library to parse a bunch of HL7 V2 feeds coming out of our EHR to populate this database. So we were taking HL7 V2 ADT feeds and labs feeds and med order feeds and med admin feeds and nutrition feeds, all the typical HL7 V2 feeds that you could get out of an EHR. We converted them all into our proprietary data format, stuffed them in a repository. And we'd stood up this little service bus that allowed a whole bunch of fascinating apps that got developed by the organization to get access to that data. And these days, all the rage for building services, everybody was talking about enterprise service buses and SOAP, the Simple Object Access Protocol, which was all the rage for building data APIs back in those days. And it was really a clunky protocol with absolutely awful security protocols built on top of it. Anyone who's never had to deal with SOAP and the WS Star security suite I envy you because that stuff was absolutely a nightmare to work with. But in those days, it was all the rage. So it was the thing we built up. And we had just this incredible suite of app developers around the organization, all kinds of different departments building apps. So it was really kind of a neat little ecosystem that had sprung up by 2013 at UHN of app developers working against our information bus. Um, we in 2012 saw FHIR, and in those days it was really early days. I mean, FHIR's early releases weren't even called FHIR; they were called Resources for Health, and the early releases of FHIR were very crude. But we looked at it and thought, this is amazing. I mean, it solved so many problems that we had in solving the thing that I have up on the screen here. Our clunky proprietary SOAP protocol. People were using it and they were happy because they were getting data out of it, but they hated dealing with SOAP. They hated the proprietary data model we'd come up with because we were a bunch of developers that were really not sure how to design a good API in those days. And FHIR, of course, came along with this, this data model, this protocol that was a community contribution and took all of the best ideas from a pretty diverse set of people that were contributing to it, even its early days. And we looked at it and said, this is way better than what we created. Let's find a way of putting this new FHIR standard on top of our existing proprietary data repository as a different way for people to get access to data from that repository. And we thought, well, we were so successful with our HAPI HL7 V2 open source library that why don't we try it again? Let's create a FHIR version of the library that will power our internal FHIR applications, and let's put that out into the world as open source and see if people are interested. And as it turned out, people were interested. That project took on a whole new life of its own. So it grew. I think these days it's grown to be much bigger even than the V2 library. But that was its genesis. That was where that thing came from. HAPI over the many years, and I will get to actually talking about the library itself and what it does in a moment. But I will say we call ourselves a software global good. We are truly global in scope. This diagram or this picture, which is a Google Analytics tracker, is a thing that I've often referred to over the years. It's in many ways serves, I think, as a good proxy for where is FHIR itself getting used around the world. This map represents hits to our documentation pages for HAPI FHIR. And of course, the bigger circles mean more hits and the smaller circles mean fewer hits. But this is a yearly snapshot of, and I think this was taken 2 or 3 years ago. I need to do a new one of these things, but this represents where are people looking at our developer documentation, which I think ultimately means where are people using HAPI and ultimately means where are people using FHIR. And I mean, as you can see here, lots of activity around the world in terms of FHIR. For the longest time, there was, it's been pretty global for a pretty long time. I mean, Africa has always been our one weak spot. I would say these days, even that's starting to pick up. So that's great. I mean, FHIR truly is a global standard, and HAPI FHIR along the way has become the a global reference implementation for that standard, which I think is really fun. We have a couple of key design goals that I want to talk about very briefly before even getting into the functionality of the library, just because this is so critical to understanding HAPI, the framework, and our philosophy behind it. First off, we believe that you should be able to use HAPI absolutely everywhere you want to use it. And in any context, in any place, on any platform, it should be usable. We are a Java-based library, and Java, of course, is a very cross-platform language. There are Java implementations for whatever architecture you want to use. I mean, we run on Windows, we run on Linux, we run on Solaris, we run on Spark, we run on, old workstations, we run on Raspberry Pis. You pick your location, you can probably run HAPI there. Pretty impressive, I always think. Even more important than that, we use a truly open source library, the Apache 2 license, which is often referred to as a very business-friendly license. I don't want to get into all the nerdery of open source license differences, but I will say we are accepting of, and more importantly, very encouraging of people using HAPI FHIR in commercial products. If you are building something you want to sell, you're absolutely welcome to use HAPI FHIR as a part of that product. You are under no obligations to tell us about what you're doing, to pay us anything, to disclose anything to us. None of those are obligations. So, we very much encourage you to use HAPI as a part of your commercial products. And we know that many people in the world are doing that today and, have successful products that they're doing with that. We tried very hard to sort of, limit the number of software dependencies that HAPI needs. We try not to pull in a million different libraries. We try and sort of build very loosely coupled, pluggable components. I'm going to get into all of the different parts of the library over the next many slides to tell you about all of the things that you could use in HAPI. I do want to stress that we try to make these things sort of independent from each other as much as we can, so you can pick only the parts of the framework that you actually need to use, and you're not encumbered by this giant heavyweight framework that does more than you need. We've certainly been inspired along the way by things like the Spring framework, which is a very popular Java framework, as well as the very popular .NET API. I'm assuming that there probably already has been or will be soon a similar webinar from Firely on their open source .NET SDK. It's an excellent SDK, sort of I don't know, not officially, but I think in many ways it's sort of a sister project to HAPI FHIR. We compare notes quite frequently with Firely in terms of what they're doing with their open source library, and we've borrowed lots of good ideas from each other over the years. So while the two libraries, I mean, they have some differences and in many cases, some pretty significant differences. They are very philosophically aligned and certainly are aimed at solving the same problem for both the .NET and the Java developer communities out there. So there we go. This diagram represents all of the major components of the HAPI FHIR framework. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them because this webinar would probably never end if I tried to go into detail. I will mention we do a training course through HL7 on HAPI FHIR. We typically do it once a year. It happened in May last year, and I will guess it'll probably happen in May again this year. So a quick shout out for that. If you're interested in learning, in way more detail, we do this over the span of 3 days. It's done virtually. We do actually do in-person ones at working group meetings occasionally as well. So, if you're interested in really deep dives into all of these components and learning how they work, I will absolutely recommend you, get in touch with HL7's education department and talk to them about when we'll be offering the next training course. It is, I don't know, I'm a biased person, of course, because I help develop the content and often deliver that content, but I think it's a great course. So there we go. I say all of that just because this diagram ends up being the framework we use to guide that course as well. We sort of do deep dives into most of the boxes on this screen. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. This has been a fun webinar. As I said, we will make the slides and the recording available, and would love to hear from you in the future.
Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next one.